Hello and welcome to this first episode of um, Africa No Borders. This is going to be focusing on issues specifically concerning um, Africa, not just in the place, but the wider diaspora issues that affect and concern people of African descent, and that may be Europe, North America, the world, and friends of Africa, not necessarily just folks that are specifically of African descent, but people who care about Africa, want to invest in Africa, want to do things for the global diaspora, Africa. And so today I start with a question that says, is another Africa possible? And the reason I say that is because just the last few days, and just in the case of the case of Sudan, where there's fighting, and previous cases, Ethiopia, instability, and various issues going on in other countries. In the last few days, we've seen violence flare up in Senegal, and Senegal has suffered instability after the opposition leader was jailed, which then raises questions about peaceful transfers of power in the region and the continent. And if I remember correctly, the charge or the reason or the justification for his arrest was something to do with, inciting the youth, and I'm paraphrasing, not exactly those words, but it was some weird, to say the very least, charge that led to his jailing for, I think, 2 years, and when elections are coming up in the next several months or so. So in the last few days, so is another Africa possible? So in the last few days, in the middle of all the other grim news of war in Ukraine, clashes in Kosovo, and the sad Indian train crash that led to losses of lives of hundreds of people, Senegal's increasing instability has not necessarily received as much coverage or notice. A brief background: the West African country has remained comparatively peaceful in the region, which is not immune to political violence. We saw issues in Mali, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so on and so forth. And also we see a rising instability of a xenophobic nature in Tunisia, where the ailing president is becoming increasingly authoritarian. So the background is Senegal is a former colony of France, like many or other West African and North African countries. Its current president is now serving his second term, who defeated the previous president in 2012. The length of the presidential term was reduced from 7 years to 5. However, the current turn of events appear to be a backward step in the continuation of the peaceful transfer of power in the country. Now, Senegal is not alone in experiencing such violence, as I've described. Other countries include Sierra Leone, Liberia, Mali, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Burundi, Somalia, among others, have followed the same path. Of course, we shouldn't forget Libya, Egypt, and now increasingly Tunisia. So again, I pose the question, is another Africa possible? Is a better governed Africa possible? And if so, when and how? First, we need to acknowledge some success stories in countries like Botswana, Ghana, Zambia, to some extent Kenya and Tanzania, among other countries, continue to largely conduct peaceful transfers of power, although not without controversy and local issues, but they don't necessarily flare up into widespread violence. And this serves as an example that yes, another and better Africa by Africans is not only possible, but can lead to flourishing. And the other source of optimism is the continent's best resource, which is the young, resilient, and energetic population. And we saw this resilience during the COVID years when COVID ravaged the rest of the world, which was better resourced with better vaccination facilities and medical facilities. Fortunately, Africa remained largely untouched to some extent. That's not to minimize the losses of lives for the loved ones, but comparatively to other regions, especially given the grim news that people were, were saying, were propagating and predicting, that did not come to surface. And I suspect that has something to do with the young, resilient, and energetic population. Now, decades after the post-colonial leaders are slowly being replaced or retiring, and it's no longer just acceptable to the population to simply blame all the continent's troubles on colonialism, while ignoring the leaders perpetrating the same practices. Now, that's not to minimize the injustices and the horrors of colonialism, some of which include obviously torture, killing, violence, and so on and so forth. But it's no longer just acceptable to blame all the ills on colonialism. Now, the young generation is more agile, it's interconnected with the world through social media revolution, and wants better lives for themselves and their communities because they see what is possible and what countries like China, in spite of the human rights records, and Korea and Dubai and others have done with the relatively little resources that they have. And so through that interconnection, through the social media, they see what is possible and they want a better future for themselves. And so they see the potential that's in their own countries rather than migrate and suffer the same levels of injustice, some of which are connected to racism and the indignities that they see their kinfolk suffer in the West, and in some cases, as we saw in some areas in the Arab countries. So they see that and they want to remain on the continent, and therefore they demand better. But the strongest and most resourceful for change comes from the Africa outside Africa. And that's the global diaspora that spans from North America to Australia, from China to the Middle East, and from the Caribbean to South America. Now, there have been recent returns to the continent from Europe and North America by people of African descent who state, from their own accounts, they're sick of the increasing injustices and racism, sometimes violence against them, they endure in all facets of their lives. This despite them being nationals and citizens of the countries in which they live. And so Ghana was not necessarily the only country, but publicized the year of return, which has largely been effective, while others have flocked to other countries in the East and Southern Africa to invest, live, tour, visit. And although there are structural and institutional impediments, such as infrastructure issues, the return has created a realization of the existence of other options for the global African diaspora and other people who want to live and work and invest in Africa and call Africa home. And where they're not visible, and also they want to be in places where they blend in, where they're not just a visible minority, but simply blend in and only be distinguished from their personal characteristics other than the obvious color of their skin, which is sadly it comes with encumbered by injustice, discrimination, and sometimes dangerous outcomes associated with being black outside the African continent. Now, the collective factors of the youth in the continent, new technology, and the global black diaspora of African descent makes it inevitable that another better Africa is not only inevitable, but is an increasing happening reality. But it must be stressed that the economic and social development of any society is underpinned by peaceful transfers of power, political stability, genuine political stability, not suppression or oppression, because after some time that leads to schisms and violence in the long run. But with a version of democracy or transitional plan, which then has a ripple effect on other areas and facets of life. Now, that could be a local mechanism, not necessarily the globally accepted way of conducting peaceful transfers of power, but a local mechanism that allows for accountability, that allows for democratic norms, institutional checks and balances, and is a path that is genuinely chosen by the people. Of course, there are unique local structures, grounds like Singapore, Emirates in China, or even Tanzania, where it's not necessarily the Western version of democracy, but all these have a transitional plan where power is peacefully transferred from one leader to another. And without that, everything else is arguably an illusion. Now, the good news is that all the factors that make another better Africa possible are in place. And we hope the current Senegalese leadership and others like Sudan recognize the potential the countries have. Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, they recognize the potential these countries have and the eventual successes and desist from the path of what is only leads to self-destruction and mutilation through political violence, which eventually leads to destructive outcomes for the respective countries. But as things stand, despite what's going on in Senegal, another and better Africa is not only possible, but it is inevitable. And thank you. And there we shall leave it on this first episode of Africa Without Borders. Another Africa is possible. And we shall speak again. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye. Subscribe and like so we can have these conversations more often on a broader stage. Thank you and goodbye. We shall speak again.